Hello, and welcome to Inspired to Taste. I'm Liz Joy, and today I'll be decorating a set of fashion-inspired cookies based on one of my own outfits. Let's get started by making a cookie version of this ruffled gold blouse and vintage-look military jacket. I'm starting by using a black edible marker to color in this area. Then I'm going to outline and very loosely fill in the blouse section with hybrid consistency royal icing. You can use a paintbrush to brush the icing into place, which gives it more of a billowy, realistic fabric texture. I'll be making the jacket sections out of chocolate fondant. I like to use thinly rolled fondant for lots of my edible fabric effects because it creates a realistic flat surface that can also be textured, as opposed to royal icing flood, which tends to create more of a rounded pillowy shape. I generally like to cut out the shapes where the natural clothing seams would fall, which makes it easier to attach these delicate fondant pieces and fit everything into place. Otherwise, it can tend to stretch and become distorted. You can use just a tiny bit of water as glue. The cookie surface just needs to be very slightly damp for the fondant to stick. Make sure not to soak it. Next, I'm using a clay tool to create gathers, wrinkles, and stitching. Then I'm adding the lapels, carefully attaching them with a little bit of royal icing. And adding more stitching. I decided to create a suede effect on this jacket instead of velvet like the sample piece, just because I've done a lot of edible velvet lately and I felt like taking this one in a slightly different direction. To create this effect, first brush the surface of the fondant with a tiny bit of water. Again, it should not be soaked. Then spoon cocoa powder onto the dampened surface. I created this custom deep chocolate color by mixing a bit of Hershey's cocoa with Dutch processed cocoa. If you're enjoying this video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. I always enjoy reading your comments, and I'd love to hear what you think of these cookie designs. After covering everything in an even layer, gently pat it down, then set this aside to dry for about 20 to 30 minutes. Once it's fully set, we can shake and tap off the excess. Then gently brush off the remaining loose cocoa powder. I like to use a soft fan brush for this part. Now I'm using a medium petal tip and stiff consistency royal icing to pipe a loose zigzag for this center ruffle accent. To fancy up all my edges, I'm adding dots of royal icing. This is one of my very favorite tricks to soften fabric effect edges. Then, more dots for the buttons. Next up, I'm going to be painting some very subtle highlights to exaggerate all my details. These would naturally fall on all the high points, like the edge of the seams and the tops of gathers and wrinkles. And then a sweep of Bakel edible metallic gold on the buttons. I decided to make these clothing cookies extra rich by turning them into sandwich cookies, filled with a thick and delicious chocolate and mascarpone ganache. Let's cookiefy this skirt next. I'm starting with the mesh underskirt using a brush embroidery technique for this layer. And these dots again for a softer edge. This cookie will be decorated all with royal icing. Using a hybrid consistency, I'm going to outline and flood every other pleated section. Allow these to dry for about 5 to 10 minutes, then fill in the remaining sections. Then I'm going to allow all this to dry overnight before moving on. Once my icing has completely set, I'm going to use a green fine liner food coloring pen from Drip Color to draw the pattern onto the skirt. This food coloring can tend to smear, but that's a really easy fix by setting it with a dusting of cornstarch. For the next step, I want to add some sparkly green details, but I don't currently have the correct color in my collection. So I'm going to challenge my patience and create the effect myself by first painting the pattern with metallic gold, and then coloring over that with the green food coloring pen. Jury's out whether the time and eyeball strain was worth it, but I do think it looks really pretty. I wanted to add a bit more depth to these layers, so I'm exaggerating the existing shadows with a subtle wash of dark green food coloring thinned out with a bit of vodka. Then piping a center line onto each pleat and adding stitching at the bottom edge. Next comes some of this luscious ganache filling. Moving on to the boots. I'm going to be using a textured plastic cutting board to create the leather look. Dusting it lightly with cornstarch before rolling out my chocolate fondant. If working with a template instead of a cookie cutter, make sure to use a very light touch to avoid smoothing out the texture. I'll be using these clay and fondant tools to add creases, wrinkles, and stitching to the boots. Next come the straps, which I'm attaching with a tiny bit of water. And adding more stitching and notches to these. Then piping the buckles. And the sole. Did you know you can paint with cocoa powder? That's what I'm going to do here. Just add a few drops of clear alcohol like vodka and mix to your desired consistency. Then deepen all the existing shadows with a wash of chocolate paint. Next up are a few subtle highlights. and metallic gold on both buckles. And finally, a yummy layer of filling. Let's take a closer look at the final step before digging in.
3, 2, 1.